Right up. Yeah, recording. now, now, you would think that to get ready to teach the basic teachings of the Buddha, that I would, meditate for a while and get all relaxed and in positive thoughts. But no, rather, it's just the middle of an ordinary day and all the vicissitudes of ordinary life, and that's something to think about because really, what any spiritual, I mean, let me say something about spiritual practices because we are going to be talking now about, explicitly spiritual practice. So pedagogically, as a teacher, that's a tricky thing. I would say a couple things. There's no magic involved here. This is an old tradition that's been around for a long time. Many very smart people have been involved in it, just as with Hinduism, of course, and all the varieties of Christianity, not to mention Judaism and all the rest. So these aren't, any of these long traditions that so many people have invested so much in. There's a lot in there. You might have a hard time digging it out, but it's in there. And, the best thing to do is to, take what you can use and leave the rest for someone else, if you ask me. But anyway, a couple things. If the world was not a really difficult place, then we wouldn't talk about ethics and we wouldn't talk about spirituality. They're not, to talk about and think about ethics and spirituality is not really a utopian activity. It's actually an activity that we do in the face of the really rather dire circumstances that we find ourselves in as embodied beings in the world. So the existence of doctrines like Buddhism and various ethical philosophies and all the rest of it is really evidence of and a reflection of actually the difficulty of life. And that's something to bear in mind, I think. Another thing is there's no magic here. As I said before, we're just going to get to some very clear ideas. We want to see what these ideas are, put them in some kind of context, but they're not mystical. There's a real, I find, there's a real stereotype about Asian thought that it's somehow mystical, and I'm not sure exactly what people mean by mystical, but one thing they obviously mean is something negative, which is that it's not sort of rational or kind of doesn't make sense or scan. But I think there's a human common denominator. I think one human being has to really persuade another human being that they're talking about something and saying something about it that makes sense. And I just don't think there's any way to get around that. So you're just going to have to we all have to use our own sense when we look at this. I try and make a connection that's real between spirituality and philosophy in the Asian traditions, but sometimes we just have to talk about the spirituality. So anyway, what we're going to talk about today is, someday I'll learn about how to use this thing. The Buddha Dharma. Buddha Dharma, so let's get that one up there. Now, Dharma is one of these Sanskrit words that means a lot of different things. Quite a few classical Indian philosophers in various traditions would tell you that the universe was actually made out of dharmas. And then another thing that's very tricky about Asian philosophy and Buddhist philosophy that we're going to have to work on a bit at seeing how far we get into this is they really don't have a kind of mind-body distinction of the inner world and the outer world that's something we're really used to thinking about. I think people coming out of this European tradition, like English speakers or Spanish speakers, I think we've all really deeply internalized some Cartesian intuitions about the idea that there's an inner mind and then an outer world, and they're not the same. And so it can be difficult to understand what Buddhist writers are saying sometimes because they really have they don't have the distinction. So anyway, the Buddha Dharma, what we mean when we say the Buddha Dharma by Dharma is the basic teaching of the Buddha. This is the basic teachings of the Buddha. And then from there on, we'll go on looking at the tradition. But these are the core ideas that we can actually identify with Siddhartha Gautama, the ones that he supposedly came to him at his moment of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. There are Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is suffering. This is what I started. Remember, I made those remarks at the beginning about um, seeing that it's all too real when we talk about spirituality and when we talk about morality. Um, right. So that's it, that we wouldn't come for spiritual relief if we weren't suffering. Uh, One place not to go if you want to find a lot of people who aren't suffering at all is to some sort of spiritual organization or spiritual activity, because at those kinds of activities, most of the people there are there because somehow they were experiencing some kind of existential suffering in this world, and that's what it's all about. Um, so suffering, there's pain, but there's a couple other kinds of suffering that come under this heading of dukkha there. That's the Sanskrit word that generally is translated. I think really it might even be that the best word rather than suffering would be dissatisfaction. It's not quite as sexy as the first noble truth. All life is dissatisfaction. But it's getting maybe just slightly closer to it, because part of dukkha, dukkha is not only the craving for the piece of pie that you have. Dukkha is also the pleasure in the eating of the piece of pie, and that's the samsara, the worldly satisfaction. But that satisfaction is in that cycle of that kind of satisfaction and craving, because it doesn't ever. Because it's impermanent. It's coming to be and passing away. See, so that's the thing. So a lot of the positive of the consumer world is dukkha, right? And anything that addicts us is dukkha. Anything that we become fixated on or obsessed with is dukkha. And so notably then, that certainly includes a lot of things that we think of as desirable things or pleasurable things or things that we want. And that's all part of dukkha too. So dukkha is not just a pain in your ass. And another part of dukkha that I already mentioned, impermanence. And of course, you are impermanent too, and I am impermanent. We have come to be, and we will pass away. And that leads then, and again, that's a function of our bodies. Our bodies are going to come to be and pass away. We're biological organisms, so we're going to have a life cycle, and then it's going to end. So that leads us to a lot of fear about the future, the immediate future, the long-term future, all kinds of stuff. So that fear of death and worrying about the future, anxiety about the future, is another part of dukkha, because it's another part of impermanence. We are impermanent. So we have dukkha, which is the word, again, I would say dissatisfaction maybe is a good word. Suffering is the way it's almost always translated, which is fine. And then in Buddhism, again, these Sanskrit words, dukkha, samsara, will have slightly different connotations in Hinduism, in Jainism, in Buddhism. I'm sticking pretty closely here. Life in the cycle of birth and death, life in the material world, is samsara. And so your nature as a being who is incarnate and then reincarnate is samsara. And dukkha is the condition of living in samsara. Okay. As I say. But Buddha goes into this to some extent. He gives us the 12-point cycle of dependent arising. That's a common phrase to describe it. The phrase that I think is good. It's all about the ego. There's sort of two selves. Buddhism has a positive view of human nature. Let me step out of this, just a free form on this one for a minute. The idea is not so much that you have a wicked soul that needs salvation. The idea in Buddhism is that you have a Buddha self, a Buddha nature that is within you, but that through this karmic process of samsara, of dependent arising, you have developed an ego. And so one way to think about it is in terms of the one and the many. Inasmuch as you are an individual, even at the level of being an individual living and dying object, as I said, uh, then to that extent, you are an ego. You are one of the many. You are one of the myriad of things, each one different from all the rest. And so the maximum state of spiritual dissatisfaction is when it's just absolutely your little ego just against the whole rest of the universe. As a teacher, I get young adults sort of coming out of nowhere who are working through really something really sort of as cosmic as that, just getting it's so scary. So anyway, so he gives us another little chunk of his teaching. It's called the 5 aggregates of self. I'm not going to give you any visuals on the 5 aggregates of self, but the point is that the self sort of disintegrates. Remember, in that very strict Vedic tradition, your soul, yourself, is on this wheel of karma for just infinities of time, which is why you're very fatalistically stuck where you are. And that's the element of traditional conservative Orthodox Hinduism that Buddha is pushing against, that Siddhartha Gautama is pushing against. And he is teaching that there can be progress on this sort of Bodhi path in one lifetime. Okay, so so let's go back to the slide-olios. All right. So the enemy is kind of this ego. There's sort of two selves. You have this sort of carapace, this kind of kaskara self that needs to be, need to break yourself out of this shell and reveal your sort of true self to yourself. Find yourself inside yourself. A basically positive view of human nature, but one that human nature is corrupted by its interactions with the material world and by the body. And by the way, very similar to that Abrahamic tradition of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in that regard. And Buddhism and Hinduism, not all of Hinduism, but Buddhism tends at least to be really pretty strict. Somehow Asian philosophy has the reputation of being sort of sexually libertine, but actually the demands are pretty strict because of the necessity for self-control. The 12-point cycle of dependent arising is circular. These are ancient concepts that we put names onto, modern English words on or Spanish words onto them. It sort of makes sense. It doesn't entirely make sense. You have to go along. You have to get with the groove of what is being said. So this ego is then a mental formation, a sort of creation of the mind. This ego that wants to sandbag itself against the rest of reality. We talked about the one and the many, so I talked about the ego of samsara. The dukkha ego is that ego of the many, when you see yourself as one among many, one against the rest. But then think about the oneness, everything is one thing. And so when we get into Buddhist metaphysics a little bit, we get into Mahayana philosophy a little bit, see, exploring that idea that the universe is one thing and that everything else in the universe is the cause and condition of each thing yourself. Anyway, so samsara, ego, the same thing, outer and inner, right? That is, again, to forget about, you sort of create the world, and as the world creates you through this dialectical relationship. This whole 12-point cycle of dependent arising of Buddha's Dharma, of the original Buddha Dharma, is very dialectical, right? It's all about, through this interaction, you get into this existence of craving and satisfaction. So I'll show you some graphs. There are a lot of them. So you know about Asian art, Hindu art, Buddhist art. There are a lot of mandalas, circular formations, psychedelic. You can see that it's signifying infinity and some other things. But now that you know about the 12-point cycle of dependent arising, there's two wheels of karma. There's the wheel of karma of dependent arising, the bad wheel of karma, and there's the wheel of karma of the eightfold path, the wheel of the path of liberation. So a lot of these mandalas and circular things that you're looking at when you look at South Asian art are representations of these ideas. So here's the 12-point cycle of dependent arising. And so you notice from birth comes suffering, and from suffering comes ignorance. And then if we're ignorant, then we make these mental formations and we become conscious of the mental formations, at which point our mind separates itself from the body, etc. I won't walk through the whole thing, but notice it's a continuous thing. It's everything at once. From feeling, because you feel, you have craving. Because you crave things, you're attached to things. You think you're attached to things, so you crave them, but it's your craving nature that attaches you to things. And so in that attachment, you build yourself by these commitments and belongings and possessions and this identity that you construct. And all of that is becoming a samsara ego, the experiencer of dukkha. So here we see on the two sides, that left side is the one that we've been talking about, the 12-point cycle of dependent arising, and then the eightfold path that we're going to talk about next. So the opposite of suffering here, I notice it says unbinding. So you're all bound up with the world through your engagement with the world. And so that's why you're suffering. And we'll talk about what nirvana means. Another one of these Sanskrit words like karma or Buddha that doesn't mean anything like the way the pop, culture meaning, but we'll talk about that in a second. So this is what I was talking about. A lot of these things that you see are actually going to be, if you look closely, in this case, this is the 12-point cycle of dependent arising. You'll often see this demon. The demon is holding on to the wheel of karma, because if you fall into the wheel of karma and you become a soul that's only living in samsara, then you will suffer. The demon will get you. So that's the idea. And gargoyles like that, the iconography is awfully different from European iconography, to be sure. But gargoyles and things like that are actually very common in European religious iconography, I would point out. And then here we go, and telling these stories. You see the demons holding on to that one too. It looks like there's a pig in the middle. A couple different animals. All right. So the third noble truth is that suffering can be eased and even eliminated, because after all, Buddha just showed us in the second noble truth that the ego self, the samsara self, is the self that experiences dukkha, but that self is a construct, a mental formation. It itself is even just an aggregate of several other things. So notice something here. I've got this in my mind. So this Hindu problem, right, was it took thousands of years for your soul to make any room on karma at all, any progress at all. And so we saw that this sort of reformation idea of Buddha was the idea that you can make progress on the Bodhi path in one lifetime. But there's more to it than that. That is, what the Buddhists want to do ultimately in this narrative is to deconstruct the self altogether. That is, the way to free the self from the wheel of karma is the dissolution of the self. That the self itself, the self that experiences dukkha, it itself is unreal. And so, getting back, okay, as I was saying, and that makes it very philosophically interesting, because what you have here is no less than about 1,000-year period where a lot of smart people devoted themselves to this notion of consciousness and what consciousness was. So if you're living in our times and you're interested in consciousness or the philosophy of consciousness and that sort of thing, then one literature that you definitely should study is the Indian classical philosophy, and especially Buddhist and Mahayana philosophy, as far as I know, because there you're going to get some really sustained discussion of what conscious experience is and the nature of conscious experience and the metaphysics of conscious experience. So if you can get out of this ego, the ego is sort of the enemy. You think you are the ego, right? You're the ego's host. But if you can only get rid of the ego, you wouldn't suffer the way that you do. It shouldn't be that this is any kind of great revelation. I mentioned before that Buddhism isn't magic, but also these Buddhist ideas are around, and they're also very similar to ideas in other spiritual traditions. Again, it's not anything sort of super arcane or out in outer space or anything like that. As I say, so the Eightfold Path. So we got to talk about the Eightfold Path. I mean, because let me get. Because there's the thing. I mean, the good news really is that the Eightfold Path isn't magic. It's a discipline. It's a sort of lifestyle. It's a guide, if you will. That's what we're looking at when we look at the Eightfold Path. It's very feet on the ground. So you don't have to sort of chant some magic mantra and hope that this miracle is going to happen or something like that. It's not it. So the good news is it's not magic. The bad news about the Eightfold Path, though, is that it's not magic, right? I mean, it's just, here's the discipline. The discipline is a mind-taming discipline. And it can, I believe it's probably true. I believe this about lots of other traditions. I'm not like Mr. Joe Buddhist. But, it can have benefits for you. That's all, right? We'll talk more about that, what you call soteriological. What does that mean? Big word. I'll talk about that later, but it just means any doctrine that says that if you practice the discipline that's suggested here, your life will change. So think about a philosophy that's not necessarily saying you need to change your whole life, but it's just trying to give you maybe insight or something, versus a philosophy that's saying, no, what you need to do is, this is the way that you do things. This is what you should not do. Okay. And so Buddhism is one of those. So to tell you, well, yeah, you should live like this. Okay. Right. The Eightfold Path. Nothing magical or mystical. It's more of a unity than a sequence. It's not like, and so this is a funny thing in Buddhist teaching. I mean, I'm just teaching Buddhism from an academic point of view here in an academic setting. So, there's certain things I can do and certain things that I don't do. The people who are listening to me for those kinds of reasons, to get college credits and that sort of thing. So, that does shape to some extent what I have to say about it. Oh, right. Well, anyway, I just remembered what I have to say about it. Is this. See, the thing is, if the practice is that you are suffering because of a lot of, for example, goal-directed behavior, let's say, then it can't be that you can conceive of the project as having a goal, but the ordinary student would come into the teacher and say, well, what's the goal? Tell me what to do, and I want to achieve the goal. Isn't that sort of what discipline is? So it's a tricky thing that way, when you're trying to learn sort of to not to have a goal. And so when you're looking at something like the 12 points of dependent arising, then I think the temptation is to say, well, what's the order here? It's got to be 1, 2, 3. Which is where do we start? Which is the first one? You know, and when I say it's not linear, that's what I mean. It's sort of, well, these things, the Eightfold Path in particular, more even, I think, than the 12-step cycle of dependent arising. The Eightfold Path is all about, it's really a unity that wants to come together. And let's talk about nirvana there. Nirvana isn't something, nirvana is not something that would happen and then go away. Nirvana, what you want is to achieve a state of nirvana. That's the state where you're going to stay. Nirvana isn't like taking a drug and then you feel the effect of the drug and then the effect of the drug wears off. That's not what nirvana is. Nirvana is not an ecstatic state. If you were getting an ecstatic state in the sense that you had some phenomenal pleasure from getting in the state, then obviously that would be an element of the world, the experience of samsara, and it would bring you back into the dukkha cycle of craving and satisfaction. So that's not what nirvana is. Nirvana is really, I mentioned that a better word for suffering sometimes maybe might be dissatisfaction. And I think the best word for the Sanskrit word nirvana is, in English, is satisfaction. Nirvana is a state of satisfaction. It's not an otherworldly state. It's a worldly state. It's a state of being satisfied or achieving some kind of satisfaction in the world. Okay. And then the path itself, then if one was following the Eightfold Path, then that just is what nirvana is. In Chinese classical Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, meaning meditation, which is Zen, is just the Japanese translation of the Chinese word Chan. But there they have a rift in the classical period between people who think that nirvana can come upon someone suddenly, a sort of notion of grace, we'd call that. And other people think you have to work towards nirvana. And in this sense, again, nirvana just is the satisfaction that one has, that one would have were one to be able to follow successfully the Eightfold Path. So let's look at this. The Eightfold Path is typically broken down into these 3 categories. I think you can see why, but it's just a convention as far as I know. So the first category will be right conduct, comportment, the way one behaves. And of course, it's all a feedback loop. Right conduct leads to understanding, just as if you were an understanding person, you would conduct yourself correctly. But if you concentrate on conducting yourself correctly, that will also lead to understanding. If you walk the walk, you'll learn. Moral virtue is a function, after all, of conduct. That's a tricky and deep one. We have to get into that if we're doing Far Eastern philosophy, because Taoism is going to insist that positive and negative are elements of the material world. So, and that's a deep topic. But the idea is that when we experience the positive and negatives, as we do when we're making moral judgments, this is part of our living in the material world. So right speech. Now, right speech extends to a number of things. Harsh tones, verbal abuse. We do this with our domestic partners and loved ones a lot, use harsh tones. That's not right speech. Gossip, lying, needless negativity, passing along needlessly things that make people feel bad, that kind of stuff. So right speech, it's a little bit subtle, you see. I mean, it's like sort of it's the karma of what you're doing with your speech. You say something and there's the karma of what happened. 2 minutes, okay, that's fine. We're almost done anyway. No, I don't want to end the meeting right now. Right action, pretty clear there. No violence, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Right livelihood is one that people do not practice in our world. They don't worry about what's happening downstream from their money-making activities. That's what that's all about. That's very strict. I have to go fast here. Right thought. So between right conduct and understanding is sort of the discipline of right thought. Right effort's an interesting one. It's how much energy you're putting out, actually. It's not the same thing as just choosing the right thing, it's having the right amount of effort. Mindfulness is the awareness that comes with clarity of mind, and right concentration is a little technical, the purity of thought achieved through emptying the mind. Not the same, not exactly the same kind of concentration. Looking at that, for example, spontaneity that we often associate with Asian practices. And then right understanding are what's happening when everything's happening. And so these are products of our Bodhi nature. So these have a feedback loop. If we do the other six, we'll get to these. If we have these, we'll do the other six. That's the idea. Here's the Eightfold Path. And this is going to, the wheel of karma, the eightfold wheel of karma. So this will now come to an end, and I will give you some links on this one. And then we will look at King Asoka next. Oopsie. Okay, and they're going to cut this off any second, but I'm leaving too, so I don't care. All right, bye-bye.